Please join me in welcoming our first Fireside Chat of the day with former U.S. Special Envoy for Iran and current Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, Mr. Elliott Abrams, moderated by Behnam Ben Taleblu of FDD. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone. NUFDI, board, members, distinguished guests, it's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I want to get right into it with a somewhat unusual introduction because it's not every day this happens. In July 2014, Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei had a meeting with government officials. Meeting was on the record, meeting was public. And in that meeting, he said he agreed with an American analyst. I believe he called him a commentator, even though our guest's background is much more distinguished than that. And he paraphrased the commentator's blog posting, which I recommend you check out after, saying that, and agreeing, that reconciliation between Iran and America is possible, but it is not possible between the Islamic Republic and America. That person was our guest this morning, Elliott Abrams, former maximum pressure czar of Venezuela and Iran at the State Department in the previous administration, and really veteran across multiple posts in the US government in the past 4 decades. Sir, how does it feel to have Khamenei agree with you so publicly?
As long as that's the only time, that's okay. Did he spell my name right? That's it.
I usually have that problem, even in the Persian press. You got at something pretty deep there, this difference between Iran and Islamic Republic. It's a difference that many in the diaspora know. It's a difference I kind of strive to accentuate in my own personal and professional life, growing up both in New York and here. You've seen 4 decades of US government policy towards Iran, towards the Islamic Republic. Who got it right? Which administration, at what point in time in the past 4 decades did you really feel like Washington and Washington elites and administrations really understood the chasm that exists between Iran and the Islamic Republic?
I don't think we've ever gotten it exactly right. The problem has been that we've focused on one aspect or another. And it starts in the beginning, in '79, when the focus is, of course, hostages. Frequently, it has been, let's say, for the Obama administration, the nuclear file. On occasion, it's been better than that. I think in the Trump administration, we did try very hard to get hostages out, and we got some out. And I would remind you, just because it looks as if we're about to pay billions of dollars to get 4 more people out, we didn't pay anything. And yet it was possible to get some people out. There's generally been much too little focus on human rights, on the human rights of Iranians. And I think that's been a big part of the problem. That is that because of the focus on nuclear issues, we've tended in a very kind of what people would call a realist or realpolitik approach to view Iran as a black box. So you're negotiating over nukes, you deal with the regime. And you forget about the fact that actually there's a country there, you know? There's tens of millions of people there who are being repressed by that regime. So maintaining the balance is really very hard. I think you see this, here's an example. Contrast the Israeli view and the Gulf Arab view. The Israeli view is that, the critical factor is the nuclear program. Much less so for the Gulf Arabs, right? Who don't think that Iran is going to drop a nuclear weapon on Iraq or on the Emirates or on Saudi Arabia.
Although missiles are being fired with more regularity.
Missiles are. So this is now the conventional issue. It's the issue of the Houthis. It's the issue of Shia militias in Iraq. It's subversion and conventional attacks. It's not the nuclear program primarily. So everybody has his own silo. That's been the problem. And we have not had a what you might call a unified theory of how to deal with Iran that deals with terrorism and conventional attacks and the nuclear program and the human rights issue. It's really been, I don't think we've ever gotten that exactly right.
I want to get back to the nuclear question kind of being this persistent 800-pound elephant in the room in a bit, but let's start backwards actually here with your service in the administration. I like to classify the Trump administration's Iran approach as somewhat counter-conventional wisdom in D.C. Traditionally, as Elliott was saying, the Iran threat was like a wedding cake. There's this basis for which the U.S.-Iran enmity exists. There's the hostage-taking, there's terrorism, missiles, military, and the levels go up and up and up. But kind of like what happened with the nuclear issue, the more people focused on that top layer, the one you save for your next anniversary if it hasn't expired, people got to pay attention to the nuclear issue and forgot about this architecture of the threat, and that became the major source in the room. But the administration, I think, by decertifying the deal, by talking much more publicly about human rights, by disproving the myth that you could support human rights, you could support people who are protesting publicly and not have it be counterproductive, kind of turned that wedding cake into a pancake, flattened it, and it said it's all or nothing approach. Yet still, it eschewed the concept or the language of regime change. Why was that? Or was it intentional to say the problem is holistic, but the solution is only tactical?
I think the problem is partly just language. That is, if you say regime change, people think you mean war. If you say regime change, they think, oh, Saddam Hussein, I get it. Hundreds of thousands of American troops. My answer to that has always been, do we want regime change in Iran? Do you want regime change in North Korea? Do you think the people of North Korea would be better off with a different regime? Sure. I mean, how could you not, considering the nature of that regime? To me, the point is obvious about Iran as well. Have the Iranian people ever been asked whether they want the Islamic Republic or a democratic government? Would they be better off? Would their neighbors be better off? Would we be better off if there were a democratic? Sure. So, I think Reagan had this right with respect to the Soviet Union. He didn't create a war. You remember Margaret Thatcher said Ronald Reagan won the Cold War without firing a shot. But his goal was obvious. It was the end of the Soviet Union. It seems to me that's the approach we should have with respect to Iran. It's not to threaten war. It's not to invade. But it is to say we stand with the people of Iran in their desire for hopefully peaceful change to a democratic regime. I mean, to say the alternative would be to say, oh, we think it's fine that this vicious and brutal Islamic Republic dominate the people of Iran forever. Why would you say that? How could you morally say that? So I think you have to explain what you mean by regime change. You don't mean war. You mean allowing the people of Iran to determine their own future.
And I think that's something that many from different communities of concern in D.C. want. They may not be able to articulate it as well. But what you said reminds me of a quote that I was scribbling down before we came up here. It's a quote by Marcus Aurelius. It's, "What stands in the way becomes the way." Is there any chance, given all the different communities of concern here, we have people who focus exclusively on democracy promotion, we have advocates, we have analysts, we have lawyers, we have doctors, but we have people who also do military stuff, people who focus exclusively on the non-proliferation side. I see members of the diplomatic community here, journalists, people who look at Iran from all these different lenses. Yet still, like you said, this nuclear issue is this 800-pound elephant in the room. Do you think it's possible for all these different communities to coalesce to say, okay, nuclear first and then something else? Or is the nuclear issue always going to be this impediment? As you said, the hostage one was in the 70s. Because there's so many on different sides of the aisle of the analytic community and the advocate community that just kind of want to be done with the nuclear issue. But it seems to be Washington that every few years, deal or no deal, sanctions relief or no sanctions relief, that resurrects this corpse of an agreement.
That's, I wish I could, be very optimistic and say, yes, we will be able to do this. We will overcome the critical question of nukes, and we will overcome the differences we have with Russia and China and even the Europeans, and we'll overcome partisan differences in Washington. That's really...
All before 10 a.m.
Yeah, it's hard to be that optimistic. I do think, though, this is not a 0 or 100. The question is, can we do better? For example, the Biden administration says we want longer and stronger. I mean, that was what the president said during his campaign and when he came to office. I think it's very reasonable to say, okay, why did he want longer and stronger? Because there were problems with the JCPOA. It's pretty clear, I think, that we're not going to get the JCPOA, we're going to get something less, right? I mean, we all read the same things in the press. Well, it won't be 3.67% enrichment, it will be 20% enrichment, for example. Maybe we can all agree that, okay, we've got to all agree. We've got a big problem here now, because whatever the agreement is, it has not solved even the nuclear problem. Maybe with the continuing Houthi attacks, who's kidding whom? You think the Houthis went into a garage and built ballistic missiles? Come on. But with these attacks on the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, maybe we can now agree that we need to have a focus on the conventional capabilities of Iran-backed armies in Iraq, in Yemen, as well as obviously in Lebanon. Maybe. We can do better if we try. I really fear the partisan problem here. That is that, here's the problem of arms control agreements. And this, you can go back to 50 years into the Cold War. When you negotiate an agreement, it's very unlikely that you're going to say, okay, I have just negotiated this agreement, and it's really no good. I'm sorry, it's the best we could do, but it's no good. No, what you do is you defend it. And this happened throughout the Cold War. People would negotiate an agreement with the Russians. It would be criticized. I used to work for Senator Henry Jackson, who criticized the SALT Treaty. And the people who negotiated defend it and say, no, it's very good. We're going to see that, I'm afraid, with any agreement with Iran. Basically, Democrats will defend it and Republicans will attack it. It will be partisan. You'll have a couple of exceptions. We saw that already with Senator Menendez and Senator Cardin. But basically, it'll be partisan. Plus, the British, the French, and the Germans will defend the agreement. And candidly, the New York Times will defend it, and the Washington Post and CNN will defend it. And Fox will attack it. I mean, let's, be realistic.
C-SPAN?
Yeah, maybe we'll see. So the problem then is, you get into these, are you for it or against it, divisions, rather than saying, look, it's imperfect. Whether you think it's the best that could have been done or not, there's a lot not covered. From this point of view, my own view is we would be better off without an agreement for one reason. The dangers would be clearer. Everyone would agree, okay, now we have to face up to these dangers. The problem with an agreement is that, again, the people who signed it will claim, well, no, we've solved a big part of the problem. We will not have solved, even if you believe we have made progress on the nuclear front and we have delayed a nuclear weapon, if you believe that. What about missiles? Nothing. What about support for terrorist groups? What about intervention in Iraq, Yemen, Syria? What about the Iranian people? What about the human rights issue? Again, I think there will be, unfortunately, very sharp partisan divisions on this. So it's hard to be optimistic.
You know, the conference began earlier today with my friend Cameron talking about this coherence or this linkage between strategy and values. And I'm not just saying that because I'm an Iranian American, I'm saying because I believe it. I believe U.S. foreign policy need not decide between idealism or realism on Iran, that there really is a linkage between what's best for American strategy, American national interests, and America's vision of what the Middle East could and should look like, as well as what the Iranian people want, the kind of government they deserve, the century-long quest for representative government. But is there, what you mentioned as a corollary to that is that the U.S. is expressing its concern, its fear with Iranian power. Is there something to be concerned about with Iranian power, or is it how Iranian power is manifest? So,
it's this, look, it's this regime. I mean, even on the nuclear front. If you told me that for whatever reason today, the Canadian government had announced that it is going to become a nuclear weapons state, fine, I don't care. Who is threatened by this? No one is threatened by this. The problem is not Iran. The problem, we go back to the quote from Khamenei, the problem is the Islamic Republic. The people of Iran never voted to support Houthi attacks on the Emirates and Saudi Arabia. The people of Iran never voted in a referendum. Should we have a policy of death to America, death to Israel? So, you know, this is a clearer case. There are cases where you can actually wonder. Well, I'll give you a case. If you look, there are pretty good relations. Here's an example. Jordan and Israel, relations are actually improving. Electricity, water. But the polls make it very clear that that does not have popular support. It's too bad, but it's a fact. It's a fact. I mean, these are polls over, you know, decades. This is not true in the case of Iran. In the case of Iran, would there be tensions with Iraq? Sure, there'd be tensions because they're neighbors. And there are some religious tensions. But would Iran be supporting Shia militias in Iraq that refuse to accept the outcome of free elections in Iraq? No. Would Iran be concerned about Shia Lebanese? Sure. But would Iran be supporting Hezbollah as a state within a state that refuses to accept the outcome of free elections in Lebanon? No. If you think about Iranian foreign policy, not the Islamic Republic's foreign policy, Iranian foreign policy, would there be rivalries in the Gulf? Sure. Sure there would. But there would not be the kind of hostilities that you see today, not with neighbors and not with the United States. And you would see, I think, it's perfectly reasonable to believe that Iran would want nuclear power. The Emirates does. The Saudis do. As we all move toward efforts at green energy, of course, it would be a perfectly reasonable thing for Iran to want nuclear power and to insist on having some arrangement, for example, with nuclear fuel suppliers, Russia, the United States. But nuclear weapons? No, that's not Iran, that's the Islamic Republic.
That's a good point. And even in iterations of protests, I know we heard some voices from inside Iran as we were preparing for our panel. In iterations of protests, you know, you've heard commentary from 2009, you know, not Gaza, not Lebanon, my life for Iran. More recently, 2018-19 to present, forget Syria, think about us. You know, forget Assad, think about us. I think it's clear the Iranian people would have a fundamentally different nationalist, not Islamist, definition of their foreign policy ways, means, and ends. And I know some in Washington believe that, but ultimately still that hasn't, you know, caught up with the pacing thread of, oh my God, what are we going to do about the nuclear issue?
No, I think that's right. And I think, again, I think in a certain sense, Reagan was the model with the Soviets. That is, there was really strong support for the human rights movement in Russia in those days. Again, it doesn't mean conflict, it doesn't mean war, but in this case, again, this is so much a stronger case, actually, because we do have a sense of what Iranians believe and what Iranians want. And as you said, it's tragic. It's a 100-year struggle for democracy, for human rights in Iran. And it's, almost the entire 20th century. And it continues, in waves now under the most brutal repression, where the regime, when tested, has tragically proved itself willing to kill significant numbers of citizens to stay in power. And they deserve more from us. And by us, I mean every democratic country, Europe, the free world, to use an old Cold War expression, and the United States. And it's not that we're doing nothing. I mean, let's not accuse ourselves of that. But I mean, here's an example, broadcasting. Iranians listen to a lot from outside the country. There are polls, and they show that American broadcasting is not so great. For example, BBC seems to have a better audience in Iran. When did we find that out? We found that out about 25 years ago. I mean, I remember these discussions in the Bush administration. I remember these discussions in the Reagan administration. Surely we can do better. We invented this stuff, right? We invented Hollywood. It ought to be possible to have much better, meaning much more effective, news and public affairs broadcasting. It's not terrible. People in Iran listen and watch, but why isn't it the best in the world? Why isn't it constantly improving? Yet we don't seem to be able to achieve that. And we don't look at the UN, Economic and Social Council, Human Rights Council rather. Where's the focus on Iran? Very, very little is said and done in these international fora. European Parliament's better, still not as good as it could be and should be. There's a lot more that could be done. And, it was actually Condoleezza Rice who once said, democracy is never imposed. Democracy is achieved. It's dictatorship that's imposed. So we're not trying to impose anything on Iranians. Those of us outside in the United States or Europe are only saying, let Iranians decide their own country's future.
And I think as they move to try to express those things, you mentioned that in more and more recent waves, they're getting literally turned on with weapons of war by the Islamist authorities in Iran. I remember in 2019, the Aban protests, there was a 6-7-day internet blackout. Yeah. And with my friend and colleague Saeed, we wrote an article about America and the need for a protest policy playbook. I want to ask you, in those 6 and 7 days when really the internet was cut off and it was hard to get images out of Iran, it was hard to get videos out of Iran, it was hard to get messages into Iran. Over 1,500 people were killed in that short period of time. It wasn't just, to borrow from the Washington Post, democracy that died in the darkness. It was the Iranian people that were dying in the darkness. Has that experience taught the U.S. government anything about the need for a protest policy playbook so that the U.S. is never again caught flat-footed on this kind of issue? Because I think the one thing that is clear is that there will be another. There is more protests coming. And is Washington ready?
Probably not. Partly because people change, right? You move from administration to administration. So some people who've learned lessons leave. There is more. I mean, we thought about ways to do more, high-tech ways to do more. Talking to the major high-tech companies. There were some ideas we had that were impractical because Iran is such a big country. You know, there are places where, think of natural disasters. There are some times when, for example, you can put balloons over a place for internet access. But you can't do that if the government is opposed to it and will shoot them down. Sometimes you can do it along the borders, of course, but then you need the agreement of the neighboring countries. And of course, Iran is a big country. In little countries, you put things along the borders, you can cover the whole country. Not so in Iran. We thought about things like that. And there are people in some of those major companies, you know the ones I mean, who are thinking about this. So maybe next time we'll be able to do more, but I agree with you that we should be preparing because sadly, you all know, there will be a next time. The next time that people rise up, this regime will be ready to kill again to try to put it down. So there is a lot more that we could do, and that's what needs to go back to what you were saying before. That's what we need not to lose. The focus on nuclear weapons is obviously right, but it can't be the sole focus because there's so much more about the Islamic Republic's foreign policy and domestic policy that we need to focus on. We're running out of time here, so I would only say, you know, just one little story. When I was in the Reagan administration, we had a thing called Captive Nations Day. What was Captive Nations Day? The United States did not respect the absorption of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia by the Soviet Union. We never accepted it. And there were actually legations by Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia here in Washington. So once a year on Captive Nations Day, you'd go, there would be demonstrations and we would give speeches. And I was one of the officials who'd go out and say, you know, Lithuania will be free. I don't know, did the people there believe it? Did everyone believe it? It happened. It took 75 years, but it happened. We're now in what, the 40th year, more or less, 43. I'm absolutely confident that Iran will be free. And what we're trying to do here in all of these policies is support the people of Iran in their efforts to free their country and just bring it that much closer. It will happen.
You know, you really brought it home on a positive note, but I use the moderator's prerogative here. I know we're a little bit over time. Comrade, I'm going to do a little potpourri. I'm sorry about this. One last question. You know, tomorrow, you alluded to the date. Tomorrow is the 43rd anniversary of the Islamic Revolution. You know, you've been in and out of government multiple times, veteran, multiple administrations. If you treat this kind of like a surgery situation, first, do no harm, what is the one thing that Washington would do now, with tomorrow being the 43rd anniversary, that would do harm, that would actually perpetuate the Islamic Republic, and that would continue to impose this kind of pain on the Iranian people? What's the one thing Washington should be aware of that it should not be doing, to not be feeding any oxygen into this fire?
Well, clearly send no friendly message of congratulations to the people running the Islamic Republic. And I would also say, I would argue, you know, do not accept a bad nuclear deal. And if there is a nuclear deal, make clear that you understand the limitations of it. And what I would do tomorrow is send a message, ignore the regime entirely, and send a message to the Iranian people saying, we know what happened in 79. 79 was yet another effort on the part of the Iranian people to achieve a democratic Iran. And we support you in your struggle, and we know that it will ultimately succeed. That's the message that should come from the United States. I would say one other message. I was looking yesterday at the 2012 message of President Obama on the Iranian nuclear program. And tomorrow or whenever, I think, Maybe it's on the announcement of a deal or no deal. I think it would be great if President Biden would say exactly what President Obama said, which was, I don't have a containment policy. This is almost a quote. I don't have a policy of containment. I have a policy of denying Iran a nuclear weapon, and I will use any form of American power, including military power, to achieve that goal. I would like to see President Biden make the same statement.
Elliott Abrams, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Behnam and Mr. Abrams. We now have a short break for networking and coffee. Enjoy.